Hello,
Hello,
Bowerbird.
Bowerbirders. Welcome, everybody. Today, we are going to be looking at what photos design journalists are looking for in 2025.
Yep, that's what
And
we do here. Really, really
if you're
exciting
wondering,
stuff.
if you're wondering what this is the Bowerbird Show. We are the co-founders of Bowerbird. My name is Nic and and this is
Ben G. Morgan, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not really on any of the other socials.
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Instagram as well. If you enjoy this sort of content, which is talking about publishing in the architecture and design sphere, please give us a thumbs up. It encourages us to make more content and to delve into these niche topics. So, Mr. Ben, how
Yes.
did we get this topic this week? It sort of came out
So
of
so we have these things called callouts. So journalists, editors can put up a post on Bowerbird saying, hey, we're looking for specific content. And one that came up recently was a freelance writer for Dwell magazine who is looking for projects that she can pitch to her editor. And I was sending some examples across from people on Bowerbird to her. And she came back and sort of went, look, there's not enough photos here. And it made me realize that this has been happening a lot where the photography doesn't quite match up with what a publication needs or what a freelancer even needs to even pitch a project into an editor. So you're kind of falling at the first hurdle because you don't have enough photos or the right photos. And so it sort of, for me, it was kind of like, oh, there's all these things that we've been thinking about and talking about for years now, and a lot of architects and designers still don't do the things that we recommend. And again, these recommendations come from a lot of experience working with publications and what they're looking for. But we did put out a call out on LinkedIn to ask a few of our journalist friends, if they had any bugbears around photography, and we got some interesting feedback, including from Lauren Jones, who's the freelance writer for Dwell, who basically came back to us with some really interesting points. And then we've got a couple of other journalists as well.
fantastic. I think we can delve into those, get some insights from what the journalists are looking for, and understand that different journalists may be looking for different types of photos. And so when you're thinking about a package of photos, I think architects can get trapped in thinking that they're the ones trying to curate down to this perfect set for a story. Whereas something we have been saying for years is that what you're actually doing is providing a much larger set of images, which work as building blocks for journalists to use to craft a visual story. And you don't know what the visual story will be yet because different publications come from different perspectives and different angles. And so if you've just provided the images straight off your website where you've curated 6 photos, you're missing out on a lot of story opportunities.
Yeah, and over the years, we've learned lots of little tricks that help to appeal to the broadest possible audience of publications. So again, each publication has its own audience, so it's looking for specific things. Doesn't mean just because you have a set of photos that are good for one publication that you can't have a different set of photos for another publication. So really, I think a lot of this is really just getting return from your investment in photography. It's not actually adding a lot of extra cost necessarily. It's making sure you're getting the right sets of photos to appeal to as many publications as possible.
Yeah, because you can spend a lot of money creating this content and then you haven't actually matched it for the people who need to use it. And so you think you've done the right job, but sometimes you've missed one photo. It's just a simple photo that you need for a particular type of story, and now it just doesn't work, and so you've lost that opportunity to get into another publication. Great.
Cool.
Let's delve in then. Let's see what some of these comments are from journalists.
Yeah, so Lauren Jones, who is a prolific freelance writer writing for all sorts of different publications. This was the initial piece of feedback that I received from Lauren, which was making sure that a project has a shot of each interior space in the home. So, we're talking about probably full builds here or full renovations rather than, just kitchen, bathroom renovations. So having a shot of each interior space in the home, that's what Dwell needs. They need to be able to see every single one. And she also says vignette or lifestyle focused images are great, but aren't typically necessary. So that's an interesting one for me. I think a lifestyle image, there's different publications that do really want those lifestyle images. So remember, this is just one publication. But essentially, she's saying it's much better to focus on getting 10 to 15 solid images with great composition and lighting shot with an editorial lens. And I think that's an interesting one. I probably should have dug into that a little bit better, because I think as a journalist, I kind of understand what she means by editorial lens, but essentially breaking that down, it's making sure that the images tell a story in some way. So they tell the story of the project.
Yeah, and this is hard because on one hand, we're saying provide a large package of content. On the other hand, we're saying provide images which essentially tell you a narrative. And another way of describing that in the photo world might be it's like a photo essay. So you see this in galleries where you might have 5 images and there's no text. So you need to be able to tell a story, and those images need to be able to link to each other to make it, cohesive and to give it some meaning. And if you don't have that, what you end up with is just these random photos, and sometimes you're not even sure that they're connected. And I think that's what they mean by that editorial style.
Well, it's kind of what we talk about all the time. You need to know the story of your project in order to brief your photographer. So what is the story of your project? Once you understand the story, it's almost like those photographs can be like a film storyboard, where it's like, okay, well, there's the entrance, if that's what the story is about, the flow through the house. It might be like the flow from the front to the back, where there's it backs onto a beach or something like that. Understand the story of the project so that you can then use those photos to tell that story. And what will happen is, because every human's brain is geared towards a narrative, the journalist, the editor will understand those images as a narrative. And that makes it so much easier to understand what the story is, and even sort of reverse engineering a story to something. If you've got enough of those photos that you can tell maybe 3, 4, 5 stories, then you've got a lot of flexibility in how that works.
Well, a good example of the opposite of that was we talked about this earlier in the year with the Dragon House down in Noosa that I photographed, and how hard it was to get a series of images to create a narrative. So some projects are harder than others. New builds tend to be quite straightforward, especially detached residential buildings where you have a gap around the image because you instantly have an identity for that building, and you have a natural starting point, which is hero image, and then you delve into the building. When you're dealing with interiors or you're dealing with a different type of narrative, that's a little bit more challenging because you imagine you could have a narrative that starts with the homeowners. And so the starting image is, lovely couple somewhere in their house. And now you have to delve in from there and link those images together.
This is where something we've spoken about for years, which is having people in your shots. I think that's where this starts to become super relevant for the storytelling. If the story is about the client and you don't ever have a photo of the client, how do you tell that story? It makes it harder. It's not impossible, but it makes it a lot harder. So, preparing your clients for the fact that you'd like them to be a part of the shoot is something you need to start from the very beginning. Basically, after contracts are signed, you want to make sure that they're ready for that photography shoot at the end.
Well, most stories are about people. And so if you don't have people in the photos, you're losing the main vehicle to be able to construct a story. It's not that it's not possible. You can create stories. You see stories about buildings, you see stories about cars, you see stories about these physical objects. But often the stronger story is the human connection to those objects rather than just the objects themselves.
And it won't always stop you from getting published if you don't have people in your shots, or if you don't have the clients in your shots. But that's more because I think editors and publications have gotten used to the fact that they can't often get those photos, and so they've become less connected to it. I think Lauren said that publications like Dwell and Metropolis that she writes for, they'll show people, but they definitely don't want them to be the focus in every shot. So again, it's like this balance of, you do need to show the architecture as well. You don't want everything to be filled with people, because then it takes the focus into a different sort of dimension. But what we always say is, if you can set up a shot and have a person in it and then do the same shot without that person in it, you've covered all your bases. So you have shots with people and you have shots without.
Yeah, I think if you think about the framing of it, the shot isn't a zoomed up shot of a person with a slightly blurry background of a building. If you can't see the building, the story is not about the architecture. So the frame has to come back so that you can include people, but in a lot of architectural photos, the person is they're almost standing so that they're zoomed out and you see the context of the furniture or the space, and then they're there but they're not the dominant feature. And the other tricky thing with people, your human brain will always go to the eye of the people in the shots. So if those eyes are too dominant, so you can see this all the time. If you take a shot and the person's too big and you ask the person, oh, what was in that shot? They can only see the person. They don't see the building behind it. So
That's a really
there's
interesting that's an interesting insight because I'm thinking about a lot of the photography that I really like within architecture and design, and it's quite often, the people aren't facing the camera. They're, putting something into a cupboard or, they're side on or they're enjoying each other's conversation or something like that. So you never actually see someone, looking at the camera or looking towards the camera.
they're alluding to a story.
Mm.
So they're again, if you cut out the eyes, you won't be drawn to them in the same way.
Don't literally cut out the eyes. That's going to be a little bit creepy. Yeah, I think the other thing on that front, which we've had some feedback on, is proof of life. So it's not necessarily that you need people in every shot, and I've seen some fantastic shoots without people in them that have proof of life. Now, proof of life is not necessarily a messy kitchen or a messy kids' playroom. Like, you still need to style your photos, but it's things like I saw a great one the other day, which was, I think, in rural Australia somewhere, and there were a couple of work boots and something else, maybe a hat, that was sort of sitting on the floor with the big sliding doors opening out onto this rural scene. And I was like, "There's a person there. You just can't see them. They're just out of shot." And I was like, "That's sort of proof of life stuff." And yes, that's styling, and that shoot may well have had a stylist who helped with that. But also, I think you can do some of those things without too much effort. One of the classic ones that I've seen is, especially with like outdoor showers in beach houses and things like that, having the surfboard leaning up against the wall with the shower on. No person there, but
Yeah.
there's a person there. So I think, that proof of life thing is probably, if done well and done subtly and not for every single shot, that can alleviate the issue of there not being people in a space.
Yeah, and the reason people are not always included in those photos is it's very hard to get the lighting to work for both the space and the
Right.
person
Yeah.
without a lot of setup. So if you look at a fashion shoot can do it quite well, but they've chosen this one frame and it's about the person.
Mm.
And the challenge within architecture is you're trying to capture an entire building with a short time frame. So if you spend all your time on just that shower scene or somebody coming out of the beach, you might get the shot if you're lucky, if the light's good or if you've got a massive team of assistants, but you may also just ruin the shot, which is why the alluding to people is often the easy way of capturing it.
Right, that's interesting because, and then the other thing here is again the feedback from Lauren. You don't want people in every single shot, but if there are issues around getting people into those shots because of lighting, etc., I would say, well, just focus on one really good shot of the clients enjoying their space. And again, they don't necessarily need to be, well, they shouldn't necessarily be zoomed in on. Just that storytelling, and I think that's that editorial lens thing. It's like if you're talking about how nice the house is because of the way the clients enjoy the spaces, make sure you're getting at least one shot of that so that you're telling the story.
It's interesting, this idea that you'd want to get a shot of every single room. And I understand a publication wants to understand the entire house. I would probably just balance that out a little bit and say, be careful as an architect to not think that your job is to document every room. Not every room in a house is a great storytelling photo. There are lots of rooms which you have the most amazing design, and then bedroom three is just a white plasterboard box. And
Because you ran out of
technically,
money.
because you ran out of money. And you have to weigh that up. You can include the photo and technically you might be providing more content, but you also may be downgrading the overall perception of that building by including that.
Yeah, and I actually think providing more photos of the hero spaces are probably important. I can see why a publication like Dwell or a consumer publication would want more photos. There's lots of reasons. One of those leads into, I think, one of the next topics we're about to talk about, which is product in the photos. But it's also, I think that they're trying to get a holistic approach to the story. So it's like, hey, we know that we've got a photo of each space. So regardless of where the story takes us, we'll be able to use those images. But again, if you as an architect understand the stories of your project and you make sure that you're getting the key shots for each one of those stories, you probably don't notice that there's, not a photo of the butler's pantry. So I think most of it is just understanding the story and making sure you're documenting the story.
Yeah, and I think you need enough photos to be able to flesh out that story. I think that's where if you're missing a key photo, let's say you just don't have that exterior shot or you're missing the kitchen shot, they tend to be the glue. And so what are you now displaying? A bathroom and maybe a lounge room. And you miss something within the story. So I
Yeah,
think
they're
it's
the glue
more,
of the story, not just the
yeah,
project. Yeah.
it's like what's happening there. The other thing before we move on beyond people is there are some spaces which, if you do not include people, they just feel dead. There are things like restaurants, hotel lobbies. There's a whole range of those shots. I see it so often where somebody has gone into a restaurant and all the tables and chairs are empty.
Mm.
What you are presenting to the world is a failed restaurant. Like, you don't want to sit in that restaurant. You will walk past that restaurant down the street and you'll go, nobody's in that one. I'm not going in and having food there. I'm going next door because there's a big queue. So I think providing that activity is really vital for some types of spaces.
Well, and there's some shortcuts to things like that because I know why that doesn't happen. The moment a restaurant is open, even if it's the soft launch, everything gets changed, rearranged. Like the design is instantly what's the word compromised by the fact that people are now in there using that space. But one really interesting shortcut is just before opening. Usually restaurants, cafes, they will do a lot of prep. So they'll hire their or they'll bring in their staff a week before to start, testing menus and doing all of that stuff. That's probably a perfect time to go in. So what you can do then is have the staff being the people in the space. And even to the point of you think about just before a restaurant opens, the number of times you've stood there looking in a restaurant and they're setting up for the evening. That's a great opportunity because there's activity there and it's quite clear that, oh, this place hasn't opened yet. It's not that it's dead, it's that they're prepping to open. So there's always ways around that, the complexities of photography in spaces like that.
I've photographed lots of interiors where, as a photographer, you just go in, you quietly hide away, and then you blur out all the people. So you just get enough motion blur. And with good interior design, you often have good lighting. And so you just end up with this mood shot, which is different to uh, somebody photographing the menus and what you'll see on a restaurant website. You don't want that. You don't see any building. You really just see literally a menu in a darkly lit room with a small warm light on it. That's not what you're trying to go for, but you can get the atmosphere of that space because, again, you want the emotion. And if you're missing people, you can tend to you trigger the wrong emotion.
It's a good point. The emotion's really interesting. Another comment that Lauren mentions that we've spoken about many, many times over the years is real estate photography syndrome, which is where often an architect may hire someone who has experience in real estate photography. And the images that come from that, like Lauren says, that they're taken for real estate shots with the lights on, a lot of personal items in the shots or a bunch of shots, but they're all close up on, say, one item, like a corner of a kitchen or another specific feature, which is another relatively new real estate photography thing where you're building the lifestyle of living in that particular place. So yeah, I think that balance of, well, first of all, hire a professional architectural photographer. Look at the photography that you like from other architects and designers and see who their photographer is a really good way to find that. But avoid feeling like you're saving money by hiring a real estate photographer unless they've got a real eye for architecture.
It's very hard, I think, for their crossover. They're just very different because in the real estate world, you're using very wide angles to try to make the room look larger because everything is about the size of the space.
And all
Whereas
the lights turned on.
within architecture, you're trying to show the quality of the design and the colors are different. The colors in a lot of real estate agent photos are, we call it HDR. It's like a high dynamic range, which is why things look a bit fake. Whereas the dominant architectural style now is trying to make those colors bright but real, and that's what's hard. It's easy to do the sort of the fake photo. It's much harder to get something that looks natural and beautiful.
Yep. And so this sort of brings us to another commercial element of photos, which is the product that is featured in your photos.
We are talking a lot about products at the moment because we've been adding product features to Bowerbird, allowing you to tag products because the journalist network is asking us, we need to know the products because that's how we advertise and that's how we survive. So this is just the reality of what allows all of this publishing to happen. So guess what? If you include photos that have products, their journalists are going to be very happy with you because now they can tell a story and they can go out to their advertisers and say, we've got this story coming up. Guess what? Your product is going to be in part of the editorial. Would you like to run an ad next to that story? So you've still got separation between editorial and the advertising, but it makes it a lot easier for publications to run their business.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we've been talking about for weeks and months, is the ecosystem of publishing, and we all need to support that ecosystem so that it doesn't become user pays for architects and designers, because that could quite easily happen as well. And this is the interesting thing about the cross section of high-end architecture and interiors and publishing is, even if you don't have any furniture in a space, you've still got hundreds, if not thousands, of products in every single shot, because you're talking about, you know, brick, you're talking about windows, you're talking about fixtures and fittings, all of these things that you've put in because they're very high quality and they achieve all of the goals of your design. But really, the publishers are interested in that because they can then go and talk to those people. So one thing I'd say about that, obviously, you don't really want to be doing a product shoot in your architecture necessarily, but just think about, hey, are there products here that I can get a better shot of? So thinking about even things like, you know, here in Australia, we have tin roofing, color bond, steel roofing, I should say, and getting a good shot of the roof, which you have undoubtedly spent hundreds of hours detailing and getting right, getting a really good shot of that with, say, a drone or, you know, from further away, all of a sudden you've got a context shot, you've got a shot that talks about your skills in creating that particular roof, but you've also got a product shot there that is of interest to publishers and by extension product suppliers.
Well, the other benefit you get is product suppliers often have very large social media accounts. So when you include their products, so you imagine you got a beautiful piece of furniture. Let's say you get a nice shot and it's included in that. When you share that on your socials, if you tag that product supplier, you're basically going to get a free reshare. So you go through your entire project and you say, I have beautiful furniture here. I have white goods. Like I've got dishwashers. I've got washing machines. I've got roofing. I've got bricks. I've got this new material, which, you know, is becoming very popular. You could have a list of 20 different people who want to share your project with their audience. And all you needed to do was basically just include it in a nice shot.
And this is the important time to say you need to understand the license that you have with your photographer. I don't know any photographers who don't have essentially what they would call third-party usage arrangements, which means if a product supplier comes to you and asks for photos, you send them straight to your photographer.
Photographer.
And this is another thing. This is a way, again, to support the ecosystem, to support those photographers out there, because when they take those product photos, if they know that there's a product in there and there's going to be interest from that, they can take a better photo of that particular product. The product suppliers are really hungry for that sort of content for their social media, etc. They can then purchase that image from the photographer. So your photographer gets to make those little bit of extra money, extra payments on top of the photo shoot, which means the whole ecosystem is more sustainable.
Yeah, and you can end up being these featured projects for these product suppliers because of that. It's not the same as a publication, but there's still an audience there. And so you've got all these people who are looking for things. I think particularly with things like furniture and lighting, because if you're in the residential market, you're probably going to have a crossover of your clients and the product supplier's clients. Maybe a little bit different for, let's say, specified products. The things that other architects would be interested in may not have the same value, but anything that's within that public sphere, they are the things that you really want to include in your shots.
All of the product suppliers and manufacturers that we've talked to, they genuinely say that they're hungry for that photography, for that marketing material. It's not something we've made up. They're genuinely looking for that. And because otherwise they would have to create the shoot themselves. And a lot of these spaces, especially private residential, they're not able to get in there. After they find out about this project because it's published on, Arc Daily, they actually can't get in there to take their own photos. That moment has passed. The client is not going to let in a product supplier necessarily, or if they are, they're probably going to ask for a lot of money in order to do that. So quite often you are the only one with that specific piece of content in a beautifully designed space, and those product suppliers will generally will pay money for that so that they can use it as part of their campaigns.
If you're good at this, you can actually go to the product suppliers beforehand and let them know that you're planning the shoot. And you may be able to get them to co-fund the photo shoot, depending on licenses and so forth. But that allows them to be, I guess, more a participant in the photo shoot and get higher quality images. The other thing I would just say around product generally is do not shoot a building if it doesn't have furniture. We see people trying to submit finished projects to publications, and it's like an apartment with no furniture. It looks like a uni student who has moved in, and it's 6 months after, and they still can't afford to buy a bed. It's true.
I remember those days well, living on a blow up mattress for way too long. Yeah, I think the interesting thing with those is there are a few niche publications that will publish those sorts of spaces. They will be generally very architectural publications talking to other architects. So we're talking about a very small percentage of publications that will publish that. But even those, they will generally prefer to publish something with at least a few statement pieces. Like if you've got a dining room without a dining table, it's just a room. So you need, in order to have that editorial lens, to have that story there, you need furniture in there to tell the stories of the space.
And if you're going to choose furniture, so let's say you can just hire a stylist, for example. You pay the money, they'll come in and put product into your building. Choose good stuff. If you're going to Kmart and you're choosing some knockoff designer piece, that's the opposite market of what a lot of publications are aiming for. So you're shooting yourself in the foot because that publication can't do something that would discredit their advertisers. So just being aware of that and choosing, and the same for you as a designer, you want to be promoting the quality of design. So don't be putting those replicas in there and don't be providing something cheap and nasty. There's nothing wrong with cheap and good design. It's just when you are essentially misaligning with other people who design high quality things.
And I think that's where the catch-22 comes in, particularly for younger, emerging architects, maybe their first or second or third project, where they don't necessarily have the confidence to say to the owners, don't move in your terrible old couch. I'm going to bring something in for the photo shoot. And so what you end up with is we've got to get in there before the clients come in and start, adding their own touch. What I'd say is just even the client's existing furniture could be 1,000 times better than an empty space. So just consider that. But the other thing is there are product suppliers that will loan furniture out to architects, designers, photographers, stylists because they want their products in those photos. So it's generally an in-kind thing. So you won't pay for that, but it's one thing to remember for this, and there'll be a lot of established architects who might not always think about this, is usually those products, maybe even the only ones in the country at that time for a lot of those high-end product suppliers, because they basically sell to order. So when someone buys something, they'll order it in. There's a lead time of 6 weeks. So what they're often giving you is something off the showroom floor or, a very limited range that they have in that country. So what we always say is, really respect that, be very careful with that furniture, and also appreciate that these product suppliers and retailers spend a lot of money on the logistics of lending that furniture out and then getting it back. So there are those opportunities. I'd say if you're a young architect doing something really interesting, then go and talk to the showrooms directly. Literally, just walk in and say, "Hey, we're doing a photo shoot, and do you have any furniture that we might be able to borrow?" So there's always ways to do it. But yeah, as Nick says, make sure you're getting the right products for your audience.
Be respectful because, like you said, some of those pieces of furniture are worth tens of thousands of dollars, and they're having to put that into a truck, get it to you safely, trust that you don't damage that, then get that back, put it on the showroom, and then they've got lots of architects asking them for that same or different furniture within their showroom. So there's a whole pipeline or logistics that are going back and forth just to be able to get you what seems like a chair. It doesn't seem like much for you as an individual, but for those product suppliers, there's a lot of work that goes in to make that possible. Very good. What else have we got?
So a little bit of another little bit of feedback that we got from Robin Willis, who is now the lifestyle editor at Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. So 9 newspapers, I think they're called, here in Australia. So these are our major city-based newspapers here in Australia. And one of the things that she mentioned, which I think is really interesting, for her, it's about the human scale. So she's talking to a very broad audience. And so, again, the human scale becomes important for how she tells stories. So, the idea that there are people in a space is probably one of the things that she's looking for. But one really interesting thing that she said is, I think she mentioned it's Greg Natale, who's a interior designer, I think, up in Sydney. He does a portrait of himself for every project. So every time he gets a project shot, he gets a portrait shot of himself. I hadn't even really thought about this, but incredibly powerful. And when she mentioned it, I was like, I've seen so many photos of Greg Natale in media. And it's like, that's why, because he gets a new shot every time. And they like to, because again, it's not just him, it's a photo of him in the space that's being talked about. And so it's really useful, especially for newspapers, I think.
That was a new one for me too. And as soon as I heard it, I thought every single architect should be now making that just a mandatory photo.
All the photographers are going, no, we don't want to do portrait shots.
Because again, it's hard because now what you're dealing with is you're dealing with a human. Now you've got a model, so you're trying to get the right expression because you're capturing your client now who probably isn't good at being on camera. You potentially would want lights to make that person look really good, but you're running out of time. That's what the challenge is. But you think about it from a publishing perspective. You're telling the story about the building. There are so many publications who would love to combine that with the designer architect as a story. It just makes so much sense. Every Bauer kit should include a photo of the architect, especially if
In
it's
that
combined
space.
with, in that space makes it even better so that you're not just using like this random stylized black and white photo that you did in a photo shoot from 10 years ago.
Not pointing at anyone in particular. Luckily, our branding is black and white, so we can get away with that.
And then it's okay. But you can see you do this on an updated basis, and now you become part of the story, which I think is always the hard bit too with architecture. Architects are often distancing themselves from the marketing of their buildings.
Yeah, they're
But
behind the
people,
scenes.
but people hire people. They want to resonate with you. They want to connect with you. That's the other thing with people. If you take a photo of, let's say, the family in a house and they have a dog, what you are saying is, this is my ideal client. And it's allowing potential clients to envision themselves in that space. So if you don't have that, what you've got is a sterile building that you don't know who lives there or who it's for.
It's funny. It brings back Nest Architects here in Melbourne. Emilio, you did a photo shoot for him of his own house, which was this tiny little extension, like half a block with this house that had a green roof. And in my head, I see both him watering his roof, which is a weird thing, but I also see his dog. And I remember I helped him out a little bit. We shared a space, and I helped him out a little bit with some website stuff in the early days. And I always thought, like, you would come into their studio and Mowgli, his dog, would greet you at the door. And it's like, okay, so that's a part of your identities. And then you go to their website now and it's Emilio and Mowgli on their about page.
Well, that photo shoot was a green roof, which he had on top of this extension, and he was on top of the green roof watering the garden. And I think the shot was from a drone. And that ended up as the front cover of one of Stuart Harrison's books.
Right.
But you think about the story of the green roof, it makes so much more sense when you have somebody gardening on top with some water.
Which you hardly ever see because it's not actually a habitable space. You probably shouldn't have been up there. But this is ages ago. This is 10, 12 years ago.
But again, what you're doing there is you're creating a story narrative. So if you remove that person gardening, you've lost some of the magic of that shot. Now it just happens to be this green roof that nobody will ever see. Whereas if you can tell the story of what's the activity that somebody does, the same
Mm.
as if you think about photos of schools. Photos of schools are now things like playground equipment. There is some amazing playground equipment. It's going to look so much better if you have kids playing on it. Now, this is a whole other ballpark of trying to get people in the shots and all the trying to convince parents that it's okay to have kids in photos, which is why architects often bring their own kids for those sorts of photo shoots. But all you need is a couple kids swinging, and now you can see the activity. Or you imagine the shot of a child running up to the camera with joy on their face. You've now connected a positive emotion to that design. That's the power of including people on those shots.
At my son's school, which was designed by Design Inc., an extension and renovation of an old building, they actually, I can't remember who the photographer was, but they actually got full permission slips from the parents for the kids to be included in those photos. And what's really interesting about that is there are now these amazing images that the school is able to use. So they've got all the permission for that, and they're able to use those images for their own marketings. Again, that's a school. They're probably not going to pay a lot of money for photos like that. But yeah, when you think about the people who might use those shots, being able to get a lot of those, human scale shots is crucial.
There's a few shots too that we've come across over the years, which we just know they will run really, really well. They often include dogs, they often include kids, and they often include landscapes. Completely, complete tangent. But if you have a building and a beautiful landscape, they will just run all over the world. So
Well, not even necessarily a beautiful landscape. Do you remember the concrete house up in Sydney? It was I can't remember what they call it, but basically you can build a house on the exact same footprint as the old house. And so it was this suburb in Sydney full of sort of 1950s red brick houses. And then plonked in the middle of it was this concrete house that was actually the reason it was concrete is that the owners ran a concreting company. But what they did was rather than just coming in close and taking a photo just of the concrete house, they zoomed out so that you could see these two beautiful old red brick houses, which were not small either. They're big red brick houses, so the scale worked. But it told a story of, oh, this is this traditional neighborhood, and then there's this insertion of this amazing concrete house.
yeah, I do remember that because we were talking about streetscape at the time of saying you want to include ugly houses to show how good yours is. And architects often cut everything out and the building is in a bubble. You don't know where it is. You don't know
The
how it
story.
connects to a community. So there's a few other little cues in photos, things like certain trees or things that you would probably think are cliche because let's say a tram in Melbourne, super cliche if you are in Melbourne. But if you are on the other side of the world, that is your tie in. That is a cue to be able to place where that building is. And anybody who's ever been to Melbourne or traveled there will just know where it is. And
Instantly.
that
Yeah.
works for palm trees, it works for certain landscapes, it works for just there's these little cues which you just pick up on.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that Robin mentioned was a mixture of format wise, portrait and landscape. So long photos, tall photos. So having a mix of those, and the reason that's relevant for where Robin is now is that the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age actually are preferring landscape photos, whereas a lot of print magazines prefer portrait photos because it fills up the whole of the page. But essentially, don't ever just provide an imbalance of portrait and or landscape. And the other thing with that is remember if you have these very key storytelling moments, make sure you get a shot of both in both directions, or something can be well cropped. Is another option on that front.
I think on those key shots, like you often have a hero shot or something which is that signature shot. You think about you have probably four shots of that. You have landscape, you have portrait, but you have people and you have no people. So you have an overlap, and you probably don't have time to do that with every single room, and you probably end up with too many photos for that journalist to digest. But you, for those key ones, you give them the flexibility of where are they going to use it. Can they use it on the front page of a magazine? Can they use it on an Instagram story? Can they use it on a website banner? It's just you have these different formats. And sometimes it's really disappointing where you have this amazing hero shot. It is stunning, but it just doesn't fit the format of that publication. And you just
Very frustrating as a as an editor.
sometimes it's sad too when you see a journalist has chosen another image. They've still decided to publish that building, but they've had to go with, let's say, a secondary image, which is really part of the story, but not the wow one. And
Yeah, yeah,
that's just because they didn't have the right format available.
yeah. The other thing that's sort of come up again lately is overly stylized images. So that's not as in a stylist who comes in and styles a space, but the photography style itself. So a style of photography could be black and white, just to give a really obvious example.
Yeah, and this one we might give a quick overview of the style of photography that we may have seen over, like, let's say 20 years. So the big change was we went from film over to digital, and so all the colors changed. And there's probably a bit of an overlap there too, as the early digital cameras came on board, and they didn't really get the colors
Well,
exactly.
the early ones were trying to replicate the film because that's how technology evolves.
And if you look at old photos, they look very muddy. And that just means they're kind of dark. The colors often aren't as bright, and they weren't manipulated as much because obviously Photoshop, it was there. You could scan in film, but you often end up with a much darker photo. And the thing I always remember is very yellow photos, like incandescent, same as what you can see in my background there. That's actually a white wall, but we've made it orange for the video. But when you're taking photos of buildings, it can really tint an entire set of images. And so you end up with these distinct eras. The other thing was we moved from nighttime shots into these daytime shots. It
Mm.
used to be everything was twilight, which is the building is pretty much dark. You're hiding all the sins of the design, but it lights up like a lantern. And that shifted over to what is a dominant style now, which is daytime shots, bright colors, and probably including some people. If you do that, that will maximize your publishability in the world. But every now and then, you get a new style which is cool, but is not as publishable. And we saw this a few years ago. There was a European style with pastel colors and these simple interiors with zero people. The photos look awesome and are almost unpublishable unless you have a niche publication somewhere in Europe because they don't give you a full set of images. They don't match the style requirements of magazines all over the world. Anyway, we're starting to see that now, aren't we? But it's coming from a different perspective. It's coming out of video.
Yeah, I think there's this cinematic thing that comes from video that is sort of translating across into to photography. I mean, you can probably speak to it better than me,
Well,
having some technical experience.
so what's happening is in video you have color grading. And so if you watch movies, you might have often it's say a dark color or there's a blue tint which you won't realize or a green tint depending on the style of the movie. And that sets the tone. And often that is works really really well because you have motion and you have sounds and audio and the combination can be really really good. But what we're seeing is those videos have become really popular within architectural videos. And so it looks like some of the still photos are trying to match the video style. Now, I was looking at this morning going, this is fascinating. It's like, because would I do that as a still photographer? And I don't think I would. I don't think I would be copying the trend of a video style. And the reason is as an architect, you have a portfolio of photos. So if you follow trends, you're going to look back on your 10 years of photos and go, they start to look all out of place.
Mm.
So, And again, this came up today because out of nowhere, the Acute House by Wolf Architecture got published in Design Milk. I photographed that 10 years ago. And somehow it's ended up in Design Milk again, which demonstrates that you can get these older projects photographed as long as the style matches what publications currently want. I would be betting on get a consistent, high quality photo with bright, beautiful colors and some people. Maybe the people will date as well because of fashion, but generally, having that stable set of photos is probably going to serve you better than trying to chase the fashion of the day.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is if something is out ahead, so let's say there's a particular publication that's asking for a particular style of photo, I think chasing that is not a terrible idea. You're wanting to get into that, for your perception, a high value publication. So you might start to produce that. But again, just think about, hey, should this be a separate shoot? If I'm really wanting to invest in this, should I be doing one shoot that matches my portfolio and another shoot that maybe is targeted at a particular publication? What I would say in that instance is, if you can, and if you're investing in that sort of level of nuance, is get the first lot of photos, send it to the publication and say, we're going to reshoot this in your style if you're interested. So essentially, don't invest in an extra shoot on the off chance you might get into the publication of the day. Think more broadly, understand what's going on. But honestly, I think having the ability to go and get extra shots for a particular print publication is probably what you're looking at, or a high value publication. Being able to offer that to an editor or a writer can be really valuable. So especially if it's like your own home, or you have very welcoming clients, you can go, look, we can go back and get photos with the clients, or we can go back and get extra photos if you need anything in particular. That's really beneficial, and it means you don't necessarily have to cover all your bases if you have that ability there. Most projects, you don't have the ability to go back and do another shoot because the clients have signed off, close the door, off you go.
And it's been lived in too much and
Yeah,
things have
yeah.
worn out and so forth. I really like that idea though of thinking of it as here's your baseline photos. This will be your portfolio. You have consistency over 10, 15, 20 years. And then if you think the value of that individual publication is worth it, then you get the special shoot for that one publication. Then you can weigh up the value because that's what you're really doing here. If you do a stylized photo shoot for that one publication, your chances of getting published widely really drop because you're not providing the content the other publications need. So you're really trying to balance those two things up.
And the other thing is, if a lot of these styles are borrowing from cinematic looks, video aesthetics, you might find that videographer is actually able to do stills as well. They may have come from a stills background as an architectural photographer. I'm thinking like Anthony Richardson here in Australia, someone who has the ability to do both. You might find that that extra shoot with a video, which has a lot of value to you, is also an opportunity to get a few of those shots taken. So it's about prioritizing where your spend is. I think we talk about this a lot. Some architects will get professional photos taken of every single project, even if it's not sort of the hero project. They'll take those photos just so that they feel like they've documented everything. And I think having a strategic view over 12, 24 months of where you're going to spend your money on photography will allow you to do things like, hey, this is an amazing project for us. It's our target audience. The clients match with the clients that we want. Let's go and spend an extra, $3,000 on a stylist and all these other things, rather than getting every single project shot.
The other thing I would be thinking about is whether or not that trend is a long term trend. So we've seen this before where you have these large shifts in images because of technology. If there's a shift, by all means, eventually your portfolio will have to be updated to that new style. And you just have to accept that projects that are older than 10 years they're going to look outdated and you're going to lose that value of that content in the general sense. But the other thing to realize is those publications who are trying to create that unique style, if you are willing to put in the effort and the cost of doing that extra shoot, you probably elevate your chances of getting published. So the flip side of that is you could have a competitive advantage if you're willing to go the extra mile to do that for that publication. I suspect publications are moving towards more custom content. That's just my sense at the moment, rather than what we've had over the last 10 or 15 years. But then that becomes quite hard because you're deciding where you're going to invest your dollars based on that publication. So we don't know where that's going to land yet.
Yeah, and we've sort of spoken about this before. There are traditional print publications that have come from, a magazine origin, and then we have these new publications that are coming from YouTube, videography, almost cinematic origins. And they're very different publication types, but often they're all doing the same thing. That print publication is now doing video, that video publication is now doing print. So yeah, I think you might want to just wait for the dust to settle a little bit. And what I would say is if there is a publication who's saying, we want to publish this project, you need to do the photos in this style, and if you do that, then we're going to give you a front page, or we're going to give you 10 pages in a print magazine. I'd just say that the value is there in commissioning those photos. You're essentially paying to get the right content that will be published in that publication.
Very good. Well, we are coming up to the hour mark. So unless have you got anything left on your
I
list?
do. I have some questions for you because we didn't get many photographers writing back to our LinkedIn post, probably because they're out for shooting
Yeah,
projects.
buildings.
But I'm curious, you've sort of gone into some of the complexities of doing this stuff. One of the things that for me that is always a question mark is, as a journalist, I want to see more images generally within reason. I don't want to be going through 2,000 images, but um, I know that some photographers will charge per image, and I'm just wondering, is that because of the processing, or is it because they've only taken that many, or like, what's the reasoning behind having less photos rather than more?
I think it's a legacy from film where there was actually work involved in processing each image. And there is still work involved in processing more images versus less. I think for some photographers, it's part of the business model where you're slowing down the process. Sometimes you've got the custom who comes in and selects the photos. So you're creating scarcity to go through that process. But not all photographers work like that. Like I never worked like that because I actually wanted more photos because my incentive was to increase where we're getting published rather than, again, it depends what game you're playing. If you're trying to play the game of increasing revenue, then I guess you slow down, you walk through every single photo and you talk about what touch ups you'll do and all of those things. But again, I think we're in a world now where you need more images. So the idea that you're only getting 12 images, I think that's long gone. I just don't think you're going to get published as widely as if you have 50 images.
Mm-mm.
So the question is for a photographer is which model do you want to use? And look, there is some benefit in slowing things too and getting people more conscious about the images and being able to put more time into talking about every single element, especially if you can reshoot, like the ability to come back and say, we missed this shot. The emotion isn't right for this one, but it's worth going back for that one extra day to get that shot. Then that's super valuable. That's a bit of the background of why that happens.
Yeah, it sounds like from the journalist perspective, I think the more images you have, the better. But what it sounds like is it's understanding what your photographer's model is early on. And the most important thing is probably try to make sure you're capturing enough shots. So make sure you're capturing, you know, 50 shots potentially. I don't know. Again, photographers, that might be too much, but make sure you're capturing more photos, even if you're having to go back and purchase extra photos after the fact. It's really hard to go back, a month later and shoot the whole project again. I think just understanding that the initial investment, which is usually a day rate, and then the processing fees are sort of calculated on top of that. So if you're paying to have a photographer there for a day or 2 days or whatever, half a day, then make sure you're valuing that investment by making sure you're capturing enough photos of the project.
And I would suggest rather than trying to split your budget up into lots of small projects, the idea that you're documenting everything, if you have a standout project, spend days capturing amazing content. Get video content, get still content, get content with yourself in those photos, with the clients in the photos, get photos with products in the building. Just get the full suite because that will run so much further than two or three extra average projects. It's sort of it's an unfair playing field. The projects which are really, really amazing, they can get published hundreds of times versus, sure, that little project you did was nice. You might get published a couple times, but it just doesn't have the same sort of a momentum as a
Yeah.
really, really good one.
And if you're not sure whether you've got a hero project or not, send it to us on LinkedIn via email. We can have a look at it. We can give you like an honest assessment of how publishable a project is. And obviously, talking about iPhone happy snaps, that's okay for Nick and I. We can review a project from that and give you a sense of whether it's worth investing that extra money in.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to see your projects. So, okay, I think we are hitting 59 minutes, so we better wrap this up.
Look at us.
Look at us. So, thank you everybody for joining us and talking through photos in 2025. Again, if you have any comments, if you thought we got this completely wrong or we missed something, please leave comments wherever you are watching this. Love feedback because it helps us get a much better conversation rather than just me and Ben talk about stuff. And if you see us posting questions on LinkedIn or Instagram, it's because we're preparing for our next YouTube episode. And again, your feedback is essential to that. Otherwise, it's a bit of a bubble with just me and Ben.
Yep, 100%.
Okay.
Come talk to us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.